when George
the Ojai Foundation.
When George Bush is elected, they're going to confront people with the choice of a drug-free society with a trashed Bill of Rights or the present state of anarchy. They're very upset. These polls which show that, you know, the #1 issue is drugs. What a propaganda job you have to have done. I mean, there are people starving by the millions, thermonuclear weapons stacked like cordwood, people not saluting the flag,
The environment
and they
is being
say
destroyed.
the #1 issue is drugs. I mean,
That's quite to go to the tea house and get a hit.
Well, they're doing the drugs themselves.
well, I think that's it. That the drug issue, which when Ralph, God knows after the 60s, but in the second wave, when I started talking about it 10 years ago, we were just trying to get psychotherapists interested in looking at these things in therapy. And meanwhile, all this stuff is going on about crack and heroin and Noriega and this and that. So I think what it is that drugs are apparently on the historical agenda. We cannot exist half stoned and half down. We are involved in a process testing whether this nation or any nation can be... No, I'm kidding. The point is, though, you see, intelligence agencies have a huge addiction of their own, an addiction for untraceable money. And since World War II, they have, whenever they got tight for money, fallen back on their connections in the junk trade and the coke trade. And this was more or less overlooked because it allowed the creation of clandestine anti-communist armies in places like central Burma and South America and Iran. But now what's happened is that these international dope cartels have grown actually stronger than the governments that originally created them. So now there's a great deal of hand-wringing in the chancelleries and war planning rooms because the drug thing appears to have run amok. And I think that we're going to have to probably look at... I think the government's concern is they don't know where they'll get all this illicit money if they legalize drugs, but they seem to have set their own house on fire. They have a tendency to do this. I mean, I think of George Bush as a man who, when he sets his hair on fire, he puts it out with a hammer. And and the psychedelic issue is this tiny subset,
the little glitch,
never mentioned over in some corner, while they wrestle about who gets the money. That's the real drug issue from the point of view of government. Yeah, Joan.
Well, I think there's another factor here which was mentioned earlier, and that is with the increase of regulation of all aspects of our lives, so that there's a real decrease of freedom on all levels, that the impulse to actually create a context of liberation breaks out on many levels of society, not the least of which is the nostalgia for what broke open in the 60s.
I agree.
And not the least of which is the commercialization of shamanism.
Oh, yeah. People want authentic experience. People want some way of authenticating their lives. I mean, we're just sinking in an ocean of bullshit and propaganda led down the primrose path at the end of the 20th century, so narcotified and propagandized and sold out and undercut, and people want some way of breaking out of that.
And it's no mistake that it's happening on the eve of the presidential election either, where the shadow economy of the narcotizing drugs is in the background of this whole electoral process, and is actually the unexploded bomb in the campaign. But I mean, it's kind of...
That's right.
I mean, the drug in question is really up for grabs. It's not, by the way, I don't think it's, it's not only cocaine and heroin, it's also alcohol. It's the whole range of anesthetic,
Well, if you want to talk about, a new way of talking about the drug problem would be, let's talk about drugs in terms of what they do. What do we want and what do they do? So here you have a family of drugs and the typical image of the addict. What is a drug addict? Well, it's a person who has an obsessive behavior pattern that is unexamined and that causes them to return again and again to the same source of stimulus or the same source of stimulus without ever cognizing the reason why. In other words, unexamined behavior is what is alarming about drug addiction, that people behave like they are obsessed. Well, on that scale, then the most powerful drug of the late 20th century is television and propaganda. And the way in which we consume propaganda is amazing. I mean, the most intelligent of us, the ones who hold ourselves most aloof, are probably junkies through and through when it comes to the media. And the media just makes you stupider and stupider and stupider. You become less able to formulate a creative response, less able to tell what is real and what is not, less able to empower yourself. And there's just more and more and more of it. The average American watches 6.5 hours of TV per day. Average. Imagine if a drug that you smoke or shoot or snort had been introduced into this country after World War II, and that now the average American was consuming 6.5 hours a day of this thing. I mean, you would have the fundamentalists foaming at the mouth. There would be riots in the street. It's that we define these things so oddly. We don't attempt to make sense. What I was trying to say this morning about the fact that we must change our minds. We must change our minds. Business as usual will lead to exacerbated conflict over resources and turf, and eventually thermonuclear catastrophe. If the evolution of consciousness is not the way to solve the world's problems, then I don't know what it is. Well, the psychedelics were originally described as consciousness-expanding drugs. That was the phenomenological description of what they were. We need to intervene in our own psyches. We cannot afford the luxury of an unconscious mind that can throw up a Hitler or a Khomeini. We cannot afford the unexamined obsessive behavior pattern that leads us into a conditioned response when somebody leans on our territory or insults our racial heritage or something like that. We have to realize that it is going to take creative intellectual engineering to steer us through the narrow valley of being. And it's always been that way. This is what shamanism is using plants to balance and control what is otherwise an extremely violence-prone, neurotic species. The price we pay when the symbiotic relationship to the rest of nature is interrupted, we lose our bearings. I'm not talking metaphorically. I don't mean about sniffing the air and making medicine wheels. I mean about putting the chemicals, the enzymes from the natural environment into your body that create the seamless web that unites us to the purpose of the planet. These psychedelic compounds are bearing information. They are pheromones from the body of Gaia that we, by imbibing, can then attune ourselves to the larger purposes of nature, so that we then can fit ourselves into the picture. We have a purpose. It is to care for the planet, to nurture it and lead it forward, much the way bees do, much the way termites do. But we are conscious creatures. Our caring, our honey making, our architectonic activities operate on a different epistemic mode because we have somehow one foot in a higher dimension.